Welcome to RJI's podcast series hosted by RJI President Lisa Ray. Restorative Justice International is an association and network of over 6,000 members and affiliates. In this podcast series, Lisa interviews leaders from around the world who support restorative justice, including crime victims, ex-offenders, exonerees, and human rights experts. In these podcasts, you will hear from key thought leaders who support systemic justice reform based on restorative justice principles. Now here's Lisa Ray.
Today's podcast is with Chesa Boudin. Chesa Boudin is a San Francisco District Attorney elected in November 2019. Chesa ran on a platform supporting criminal justice reform based on restorative justice, addressing mass incarceration, wrongful convictions, and providing for the needs of crime victims. Chesa was a public defender before being elected district attorney. He was a Rhodes Scholar and graduated from Yale Law School. Chesa is also the son of two former members of the Weather Underground, Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert. His parents acted as getaway drivers in the 1981 Brinks Arbor car robbery in New York, resulting in the deaths of two police officers and a security guard. Both Chesa's mother and father served prison time. Kathy Boudin was released on parole in 2003. This week, as we record this podcast, RJI has learned that Chesa's father has been granted clemency by outgoing Governor Mario Cuomo. Gilbert is serving a 75-year sentence and has served 40 years. Welcome, Chesa.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And the last time we talked was when we did a RJI podcast with you in 2019 when you were running for DA. And
amazing how time flies. We've come a long way.
I had to actually check my notes to say, my gosh, when was it? And as you recall, the big news was that RJI endorsed you when you ran, as you recall. And,
I do. I very much appreciate that. It was an important endorsement. In a close race, every single endorsement makes a difference.
Well, it was the first time Restorative Justice International endorsed a candidate. So we endorsed you, and we'll talk about that. But let's talk about your tenure so far. Tell me about it since 2000. Well, you were sworn in January 2020.
Well, it's been quite a ride. You know, look, none of us could have expected or predicted the ways in which the global pandemic would reshape everything about our lives. I was sworn into office in January of 2020, and just 2 months later, we had to stop going into the office and learn how to use Zoom and figure out how to make court appearances remotely. So it really reshaped everything about how we conduct business. It, of course, changed crime trends and policing strategies. It made restorative justice work, for example, much more challenging because you can't bring community together to actually have the face-to-face conversations that are such a key part of accountability. But despite all that, I have to say I am really proud of the work my office has done. We have a lot of accomplishments under our belt, even in the face of such trying times.
Yes.
Overall crime in San Francisco has fallen. My first year in office, it fell by over 20%, driven, of course, by pandemic changes, but also showing that there are ways that we can implement policies aimed at centering victims, at helping victims heal, expanding victim services, not just a punitive response, and that we can do that in ways that are consistent with ending mass incarceration, reducing reliance on jails and prisons as a primary response, and build safety in the process. So, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is, certainly as we watched you, COVID is a huge challenge for everybody, and I can't imagine being a district attorney, but also we've been involved in criminal justice reform with RJI since 2008, and before that I was very involved in the California legislature supporting restorative justice, and yeah, the challenges are there, and as we look across the country at crime statistics, it's very hard to place the blame only on you to say, oh, in the last year crime has gone up. I mean, certainly some crimes have gone up in San Francisco, as we've seen, but to blame it all on an incoming district attorney is I think not fair. So you also, I have to point out for our listeners, you've been faced with two recall efforts, which was a surprise to us, and one apparently already failed, not getting enough qualified signatures for a ballot, but there's still an existing recall effort that's collecting signatures now. Is that right?
That's right, Lisa. And, as you were saying about crime statistics, overall crime is down. Certain categories have gone up. And what the folks in the recall are doing is they're cherry picking statistics and they're saying, oh, well, this category of crime that's gone up is all your fault. And these other categories that have gone way down, well, that's just the pandemic. And so they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have it both ways. And it's frustrating to see so much disinformation about critical issues like public safety, like crime trends, when we know you can compare San Francisco with Oakland or San Jose or, cities across the country, Houston, you name it. And what you see is actually San Francisco continues to be one of the safest cities. We've navigated the pandemic from a criminal justice standpoint far more successfully than other jurisdictions with your traditional tough on crime prosecutors. And these folks are really exploiting tragedies, the kinds of tragedies that happen every year in every big city in America. And they're exploiting them to undermine restorative justice, to undermine criminal justice reform, and to undermine policies aimed at building healthier, safer, stronger communities.
Yeah. And so the next question is an obvious one is what kind of restorative justice programs and policies have you implemented or supported since you came in? And as I said, RJI endorsed you, a strong endorsement in 2019. We did a podcast with you that people can listen to, and then they can read our endorsement of you. We were very excited to know that you were out there and you supported the vision that we have supporting victims-driven restorative justice. So why don't you answer that question about what you've implemented?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I did was I significantly expanded a program called Make It Right, which had been in a pilot data gathering phase when I took office. It's a juvenile justice program where we reach out to the victims of crimes committed by juveniles, and we ask them if they are interested in participating in restorative justice. And what we found is that over a couple of years of doing this, almost all crime victims with juvenile folks who caused the harm want restorative justice. And we've also found that when folks engage in that process, the juveniles, the young people, are far less likely to recidivate, to get rearrested. And so when I took office, this was still in a pilot testing phase. We were still doing kind of A/B control groups. I said, look, we have enough data. We know this is working. We see that it's making our community safer through reducing recidivism. We see that it's making our victims feel like they have more ownership of the process. It's what they want. And so we stopped doing the control group. We just started asking every victim of every applicable juvenile offense, is this what you want? And we continue to have great success with that program. The other thing we did, Lisa, is we started looking at how we could expand into our adult cases. And so I hired an attorney. Now she's in a management role in the office, overseeing our restorative justice expansion to adult courts as well. And we secured a $6 million grant, which has only just come online now. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be doing requests for proposals from community-based organizations that we hope to re-grant at least half of that money to. And we're in the process of hiring staff with the other half of the money that we can bring into our office to help really ramp up individualized, tailored restorative justice programs for different categories of folks who've caused harm. And the goal is to be able to put victims in the driver's seat, ask them if that's what they want, and if so, be able to meet them where they're at and give them ownership.
Right, excellent. And we've heard about that. And in fact, I think I talked to one of your staffers that came in to your office. And yeah, often crime victims, as you know, and as you're learning more about restorative justice, they really need to know more about what restorative justice is. Often what we've learned around the country and around the world, actually, in our work, is that victims don't know what the name is, but they know what they want. They don't even know it has a name. But like you said, they want power over their lives again. They want offender accountability, and they want ways to heal on some level. So let me get into an issue I know that you've had to face over the last, since you came into office, and that is hate crimes in San Francisco. And let me start off by saying RJI has actually done 2 podcasts on hate crimes. One was with an individual in the UK, and the other was a pastor in Ohio. So there has certainly been an increase, particularly with Asian hate crimes in San Francisco. So tell me about that. What have you experienced, and how have you tried to bring restorative justice into responding to hate crimes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge concern for us in San Francisco because we are proud to have the country's oldest Chinatown and also to have one of the largest Asian American Pacific Islander communities of any major city in the country. And so when we see a rise in hate speech or hate incidents targeting any group, especially a group that's such an important part of our community and our history, it's a top concern for me in my office. We've done a few things here. First of all, we have a dedicated hate crimes assistant district attorney who handles all of the hate crimes cases the police bring us from beginning to end, from the time the arrest is made or investigation is happening, all the way through whatever the outcome of the case is. The other thing we did is we created a community partnership with a bunch of different community organizations, um, primarily making up Black-led organizations and Asian-led organizations to bring them together and help build bridges, not just in the context of a specific case, but also in the context of a broader dynamic where we perceive rising tension in the community, rising distrust. And so we thought about our restorative justice work beyond any one individual case, but as a necessary part of healing community, building bridges, building trust in a way that can actually prevent future incidents from occurring. In addition, of course, when we see concrete evidence that the police bring us of crimes that are committed because of racial motivation or other hate-based motivation, we also are filing those charges with those allegations. Of course, we know that in those instances, usually the damage has already been done. Victims don't feel safe. They feel that they've been targeted unfairly because of their identity. And we want to do whatever we can to help them go back to the sense of security, the sense of belonging that they had before they were targeted.
Well, as you know, and I urge you to actually listen to the two podcasts that we did. One was with Dr. Mark Walters from the UK, who's a professor, and he's a gay man who was targeted because of his sexuality. And then also Pastor Jack Sullivan Jr. in Ohio, where we discuss it. I mean, this is a very difficult subject. I think we're on the cutting edge, RJI, nationally and globally, supporting restorative justice and hate crimes, because it is something hard to bring in this vision to hate crimes. It's just difficult. So how do you define under law a hate crime? How do you decide to actually charge somebody with a hate crime?
So the easiest way to think about it is on a spectrum. And I'm going to give you kind of four categories on that spectrum. On the one hand, sort of all the way over here, we have hate speech. Hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. It's offensive, it's morally repugnant, it's inconsistent with our values, but the First Amendment allows people to have hateful views and to express them. Then you've got you've got discrimination, what I'll call discrimination, where say a business refuses to allow someone in because they're Asian or because they're Black. Well, that is illegal, but it's not criminal. There's a civil rights action, there's civil liability there, but there's nothing a district attorney can do ordinarily from a criminal enforcement standpoint. Then further along the spectrum, you've got regular old-fashioned crimes, say vandalism or assault or robbery. And to prove those charges, we do not have to be able to establish why they did it, what the motive was. That's not
Intent.
Intent. Exactly. That's not a required element for most of those charges. Graffiti, vandalism, all you have to prove is that they did it, that they destroyed the property or that they spray painted the property. The assault, you know, they swung a fist at somebody. Doesn't matter why they did it. For a hate crime, you've got to be able to establish all of the underlying elements of the basic crime, that assault or that vandalism. Plus, you need an additional element, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt of what was in the person who caused the harm's head. What was in the person's head at the time? What motivated them? What was their intent? And I'll give you an example. We filed a couple hate crimes cases last year with Asian victims, but the basis of the hate crime allegation was not that they were Asian. It was that they were transgender. And so it's an important reminder that when we talk about hate crimes, it is not enough for us to simply have a victim who's a particular racial group or language group or religion. It's not enough to simply have a suspect or a person who causes harm who is of a different group. We need to be able to prove that the identity of the victim is precisely what motivated the attack or the vandalism. So I'll give you the best example, the easiest, most straightforward, clear-cut case of a hate crime is if someone spray paints a swastika on a synagogue. Then we know that it is a symbol that is in and of itself hateful and associated with anti-Semitism. And we know that they've chosen a target that is a safe haven, a place of worship for the Jewish people. That's an example of a quintessential hate crime.
Mm-hmm. And so do you support legislation, whether it's in California or nationally, that kind of adds more, I guess, gets more aggressive in pursuing justice and hate crimes?
I don't know that there's any reason to think that increasing the punitive response to hate crimes is an effective deterrent. What we see is mostly the folks who commit these kinds of hate crimes are suffering from mental illness. They, not that that's a legal justification, but simply to explain ratcheting up punishment is unlikely to be an effective deterrent for that group. What we see as more effective is education and restorative practices within the community that can help prevent these kinds of things from happening in the first place. We see a lot of ignorance that leads to hate crimes, a lot of race-based or religious-based ignorance, stereotypes that get out there in social media. And when people don't have real relationships with folks from different ethnic or religion or language groups, then they sometimes fixate on these stereotypes, and those stereotypes end up being the basis of a hate crime. We don't want to see another hate crime.
Sure.
We'd rather figure out how we can do the education and the bridge building between the Black and Asian community, between the Jewish and Muslim community, between the trans and cis community before those sorts of things happen. And so that's really been the focus of my community engagement, of our restorative justice engagement, is let's build those bridges. Let's do that education, that public education, before the next hate crime occurs.
Sure, and I wasn't necessarily saying that responding legislatively would be necessarily increasing sentencing, sentence enhancements. But what we found is that, and as I mentioned, the podcast that we've done and the work we've done is that victims who have been victims or their families who have been victims of hate crimes, they actually are open to restorative justice because they want to hear that the offender was sorry, that they've come to a point of remorse, they take responsibility. They often don't hear that, they don't get an apology. So they're not happy with the criminal justice system when they have no voice. And I think you see that anger in San Francisco and around the country, around the world, when hate crimes happen. So restorative justice is important after hate crimes have occurred as well. So let's move on to sentencing reform. This is something that some people who look at the work of RJI don't think we're involved in. We actually care very much about sentencing reform. And let's talk about your father. So David Gilbert this week was granted clemency by former Governor Cuomo. So tell us about that.
Well, it's Lisa, I don't have words. It's the day I've waited for. It's news I've waited for really my entire life. My dad's been in since I was 14 months old. He had a 75-year minimum sentence, and I always knew there was a probability, a likelihood that he would die in prison. And that's a difficult thing for a child to think about, to know. For me, on the eve of the birth of my first child, to think about trying to bring my baby through prison gates just to meet the grandfather. And so when I got the news on Monday that my dad had been granted clemency, his minimum sentence had been essentially reduced by 35 years down to time served. He's now eligible for parole. He's still got to get granted parole. He's not out yet.
Yes.
But this is something I've waited for my whole life. It feels like a massive weight has been lifted off my shoulders, and it couldn't come at a more emotional time as my wife and I are ready to go to the hospital to give birth at any moment.
At any time. And just to give more perspective too on your father and your mother, as I read at the beginning, it was the Brinks robbery that occurred in 1981. Is
correct?
That correct?
Yep, October of 1981.
And so your parents were getaway drivers.
That's right. My parents were unarmed getaway drivers. They weren't even technically getaway drivers from the scene of the crime. They were driving a switch car. So the folks who did the robbery and tragically killed one of the security guards at the Brinks truck fled to where my parents were waiting, switched into the truck they were driving. That truck was subsequently pulled over, and there was a shootout. People in the back of the truck shot and killed 2 police officers. Although my parents weren't armed and didn't personally hurt anybody, they were, of course, knowingly involved in the commission of a very serious felony, the armed robbery. And that armed robbery resulted in the murders of 3 men. My
Yes.
parents were convicted. My mom ended up serving 22 years in prison. And until Monday, my father had a 75-year minimum sentence. He's now eligible for parole.
Yes.
And I'm very hopeful that the parole board will grant his release and he'll be home in time for Thanksgiving.
Yes, like I said, that Restorative Justice International actually strongly supports sentencing reform because we think that there are sentences that are too extreme, and that we think that there's other ways of changing the behavior of offenders while they're in prison, so they can re-enter society, and also so victims feel that that offenders take responsibility. Now, in the case of your father, and I want to say this right now, I'd actually like to interview your father. I'd like to do that interview through the podcast here with you on the line. So maybe we can arrange that sometime. I know that you've taken responsibility, just mentioning about the impact of the crime on these victims and their families. So how does your father feel about it? I've read a little bit.
Well, one of the reasons why I love and respect my father and why we've been able to build such a strong relationship, despite the distance incarceration has created, and despite the harm that his decision to participate in that robbery caused to me and to our relationship all those years ago, is because of his remorse, because of his honesty with me and his sense of accountability for what he did. As long as I can remember, I've spoken with my father. I've asked him hard questions from the time I was a kid. Why did he do that? Didn't he know people might get hurt? What could possibly make it worth that risk? And why would he jeopardize his relationship with me and my mother? I've asked him those questions thousands of times on visits from the time I was a baby all the way up until our most recent prison visits. And his consistent and profound sense of remorse for what he participated in, for the harm it caused, was an essential part of my ability to move past my anger with him. I also know that in recent years, he's had visits from some of the victims in the case, not the families of the 3 men who were killed, but a woman who was carjacked as the folks doing the robbery tried to get away from the scene, whose mother was kidnapped in the car that was carjacked, people who were profoundly traumatized and harmed as part of the broader fallout of this horrible crime. And those visits for my father were more significant than any number of years of prison ever could be, in terms of his ability to come face to face with people who were harmed by his decisions.
Yes.
And I also know from speaking with the victim that visited him that provided a sense of closure that her testimony at trial against him never did.
Yes. Well, healing comes in many ways, and we have to be very creative as we apply restorative justice. And I know our time's limited. Let me just throw out one more question and let you comment. Let's talk quickly about wrongful convictions. That's something we care deeply about. And as you know, New Yorker Jeffrey Deskovic sits on our Global Advisory Council, and he was exonerated for a crime he did not commit in New York. So tell me just quickly what you've done on wrongful convictions.
Well, Lisa, as I promised during my 2019 campaign, I have launched an independent innocence commission that sits outside my office. It's overseen by a law professor here in San Francisco, and we have a team of experts that sit on that commission. And there's one representative from my office who helps them obtain all of the documents they need. And they're systematically going through old cases where there's a plausible innocence claim, and we're identifying folks who may be innocent. We've already submitted one application to the court, asking the court to vacate the sentence on the basis of factual innocence. We have a couple of others that are in the works. And it's just critically important work. You know, a lot of us in criminal justice focus on doing justice going forward, and we recognize the need for reforms to do things differently and better. And I say, if we know that things haven't been done well in the past, we've got to do justice retrospectively too. We've got to look backwards. We've got to undo the harms, the excesses, and certainly the wrongful convictions of the decades behind us, as well as ensuring that we don't commit any of those same kinds of people who are innocent to prison in the future.
Absolutely. And we actually, RJI sees those who have been exonerated as victims of the criminal justice system, a real critical point, and whether they get compensation when they get out. And so any concluding remarks?
Well, I just want to thank you, Lisa, for your work. You know, there's a lot of folks out there who are trying to turn restorative justice into kind of a bad word. And we see it in San Francisco. Anytime we see recidivism, for example, or we see someone who's been released pending trial, who gets rearrested. There's a lot of folks who want to say, oh, well, that's restorative justice. It doesn't work. And I say, no, actually, that's the status quo criminal justice system, which doesn't work. That's the state prison system that doesn't work. That's the jail system that doesn't work. We know that jails and prisons have recidivism rates that are around 2/3. That means about 2/3 of people getting out of jail or prison will reoffend, will reharm. That's not true with restorative justice when it's done right. And so we've got an important message. We've got an important communication challenge ahead of us. And I'm so appreciative of you and all the work that you all do at RJI to help people understand what restorative justice is and what it isn't, and how we can move forward in a way that's safer and more humane for those who've been harmed by the criminal justice system.
That's right. You're right on, spot on. Well, thank you so much, Chesa, for today, for being with us. And we continue to watch you, and we'll be here to support you and also to provide any education that you think might help your office and expanding restorative justice in San Francisco. Thank you so much. And also good luck with your new baby on the way.
Thank you so much,
blessings, Lisa. For that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Good. Take care. Thank you.
This is Lisa Ray for RJI.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the RJI podcast series with Lisa Ray. Stay in touch and support our work at restorativejusticeinternational.com.